the channel. Very interesting video for you this evening with a special guest you've met before, Dr. Shaham Das, consultant forensic psychiatrist. We're talking about the insanity plea today, which many of you may or may not be familiar with and what it means. So first of all, welcome back, Dr. Das. Good to have you here.
Mr. BlackBeltBarrister, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, so just before you get started, Dr. Das has got a very interesting case to talk about on this video. Just a very brief outline. Many people won't know what a defense of insanity is, but hopefully you will by the end of this video. But it comes about through a very, very old piece of law from the Trial of Lunatics Act of 1883. It's a defense available to all crimes, but it has a very different outcome. And it's one of a fairly special sort of defenses, which is usually not the preferred defense of the defense team. And it's one fairly unique that can be raised also by the prosecution and by the judge, a defense of insanity. But Dr. Das will be talking to you a bit more about that. So, Dr. Das, over to you. You have an interesting case study to talk about with this very special, very specific defense.
Absolutely. So it's a fascinating case to me because it's tragic. So it's about a woman called Andrea Yates, and she ended up killing her own 5 children in 2001 because she was completely floridly psychotic. So that's one aspect, the kind of emotional tangibility of the case, but also what happened with the trial. So there's many twists and turns which we'll get into. So she initially actually didn't get the finding of the insanity plea. She was initially convicted for murder, and then she had to be retried because the evidence was so weak the first time around.
And so just touching on that, so you say initially didn't get the insanity verdict. So she was, you were saying she was initially sentenced to life imprisonment, as you would be for murder. And obviously that's together with all of the trauma of going through the trial in the first place, which, I mean, the average trial for a serious trial at the moment is sort of 4 or 5 years from charge to being heard in court, depending on when that was. But that was her initial sentence, and then you said she went to appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. And she was also psychotic, I believe, for that entire period of time. So she gets sent to prison whilst in this state of psychosis, whilst hearing voices, while having these paranoid delusions. Yeah.
And so you mentioned hearing voices. So just a little bit of information for our viewers. What would somebody take psychotic to mean? A lot of people will have heard the phrase and not necessarily, or certainly not fully understand what it means. What does it mean to a layperson? Yeah.
So I think it's often misunderstood. People think that being psychotic just means being agitated or being violent, but it's not that at all. So a state of psychosis is when you step outside of reality. So typically there are 2 types of symptoms. There's either hallucinations, so hearing voices would be an example of that. Some people, they get command hallucinations, so they hear voices telling them to do things like hurt themselves or hurt other people, and it can be very compelling, really hard to resist. And then the other typical symptoms would be delusions. So delusions are fixed, unshakable beliefs. The patients that I see working as a forensic psychiatrist tend to have paranoid delusions. So they believe that people, strangers, for example, are filming them or following them or want to hurt them, for example. Yeah.
Fascinating. So how would one separate those, or is it possible for one to separate those from reality, or do they merge together?
So in the patient's mind, they're absolutely convinced. And sometimes they have experiences that they believe reinforce those ideas. So, for example, and in Andrea Yates' case, she believed that cartoon characters from the TV were talking to her and reinforcing the ideas that her children were marked by Satan, that she needed to kill them.
And she absolutely believed that this was real, as real as meeting someone in the street and having a conversation.
Yeah, I believe so. So there are a couple of telltale signs in this case was the fact that she was mentally ill for many years before, even months before the killing. She was in and out of hospital. There was lots of bizarre behaviour. So she consistently made very bizarre comments about her children being marked. And she even said that she'd been contemplating killing them for about 2 years before the fateful day.
And what's your experience with the services, the support services and social services picking these sort of things up if they're reported? I've read various comments about people reporting things and being ignored. Indeed, in my family work, I've seen all sorts of things reported to social services, rightly and wrongly, and justified and not justified reports. If someone were to report something that on the face of it sounds fairly abstract, what's your experience? What would the services typically respond to something like that?
Unfortunately, I would have to say that over the time that I've been a psychiatrist, so that's around 15 years, the threshold for people to get treatment when they become psychotic has risen. So before, it used to be people that would have these kind of symptoms, hearing voices, they would be assessed relatively simply and quickly, for example, in an accident in an emergency department. But over time, because there's been such a pressure in resources, such a lack of psychiatric beds, that the threshold has been risen to people needing to commit actual violence or being suicidal before they're even considered to have a mental health act assessment. So it's a scary prospect, and it seems to be getting worse over time.
Indeed it is. I mean, that is a scary prospect, to say that they're almost waiting for something to happen before making those real determinations, as opposed to making those determinations then sorting something out, because the argument is obviously there that if there is a need for the space, they should make the space rather than wait for something to happen. So in this case, you say with the children, and she'd had these thoughts for some time. Do you know whether that was picked up during that time, or was it all sort of after the event and they looked back retrospectively to see what she was thinking during those years?
Sure. So Andrea Yates had a very clear history of mental illness. She'd been in and out of hospital several times, and she actually had a very specific form of psychosis called Perpural Psychosis, or postpartum psychosis. So that means that she became floridly psychotic every single time that she had a child. So she had 5 children. So, for example, after the birth of her first child, she openly reported that she was having hallucinations about killing and these beliefs about wanting to kill people. But then she got better relatively quickly, and then was, I wouldn't say well, but she was, borderline lucid until she had her next child. And this kept happening. And actually, after her 4th child, she tried to commit suicide. And this bit's really shocking. She was actually discharged from hospital. She was sectioned and then discharged from hospital because the insurance company couldn't pay her costs for keeping her in. So she was let out into the community. She was given medication like antidepressants, which she didn't take because she didn't have insight. So there was just this long history of relapses and remissions. And then when we talk about the killings, so they happened in June 2001. So her youngest child, who she killed, was 6 months old. So she'd been in a state of psychosis since the birth of that child, so 6 months. And 2 months before then, she was actually hospitalized because she'd stopped eating. She had stopped looking after her baby. She was pulling out her own hair. So she was really, really unwell. And then she went into hospital and, in my opinion, was discharged far too early. So even though she was almost semi-catatonic and barely moving, because she started eating, they chucked her out of hospital, basically. So I don't think that it can be denied that her level of care was substandard.
Indeed. And so this was obviously a sequence of events that no one had really picked up on, which obviously sadly led to those results. So what happened then?
So that's kind of the context and the background of her mental health. And then on the day of the killing, so it was the 20th of June 2001, her husband, who worked for NASA, so this all happened in Houston, Texas, her husband went to work, and then Andrea Yates methodically drowned her children one by one in a bathtub. So really, really shocking case. Her kids were 6 months, as I said, I believe 2, 3, and 5 and 7 years old. And she literally took them one by one. And this bit's horrifying, but her 7-year-old son kind of clocked on to what was happening, so he tried to run away, and then she caught him at the end and drowned him and killed him. And then after she did the deed, she immediately phoned the police to tell them what she had done, and then she phoned her husband as well, which I think is quite significant, because that, to me, indicates somebody that's psychotic, that doesn't believe what they've done is wrong, because otherwise you wouldn't call the police, right? You try and hide your acts, or you try and run away. And then it was very obvious at assessment that she was floridly psychotic.
What was it that she said to the police and her husband?
So she said that her children had been marked by Satan, and they had been for many years, and that she had been thinking about killing them for a couple of years, and if she ended their lives on Earth, then they would be prevented from going to hell. And she also believed that Satan would return to hell, and the only way that she could stop that happening was to kill her children. But on top of those delusional and paranoid beliefs, there were other symptoms of psychosis. So, for example, she was hearing voices. She had these delusions of reference, is what we call them. So she believed that people from the TV or cartoon characters specifically were trying to communicate with her. So she had lots and lots of very obvious barn door symptoms of psychosis. And the diagnosis, to me, was really obvious.
And so then she was tried for murder.
Yeah.
And do you know at what stage the defence, or at least potential defence of insanity, was raised?
I think it was raised fairly early on because she was psychotic at the time of arrest. She was psychotic whilst she was in prison as well. So her defence team tried to put forward the insanity plea. And what I think is quite interesting, and it is another kind of twist to this case, is that the prosecution psychiatrist, a man called Dr. Yates, who is a kind of media borderline celebrity psychiatrist. So he worked as a consultant on Law and Order SVU. And it turned out after the trial that his expertise were a bit questionable. So I'm a bit surprised that it wasn't brought up during the trial. So, for example, he'd never assessed a case of postnatal depression before. He'd not actually clinically worked with a patient since 1982, and the trial was in 2002, so 20 years. And yeah, so some of the things he said were just false. So, for example, he said that there was an episode of Law and Order that had come out recently where a mother had done exactly that. So she killed her child and tried to blame it on psychosis. And he did give some consultation advice on this episode, but it was found out after Andrea Yates' trial that the episode hadn't aired at that point and hadn't actually aired for another couple of years.
Wow. And I think it's interesting in that I think a lot of people watching might think that this is the sort of defence that if one were caught up in such a horrific crime, that someone might try to run this sort of defence, thinking in one sense that it might be better than prison, and thinking in some sense that it makes them not guilty by reason of insanity, as the wording goes. So two questions, I suppose. One, what would your sort of typical view and response be if you believed that someone is just making up this defence, just trying to run this defence, and how easy is that to tell? And secondly, your thoughts on, which we touched on just before we started recording, your thoughts on the difference between the result, if you like. I mean, guilty of murder, go to prison for life, as opposed to what happens if you successfully run, in inverted commas, a defence of insanity.
Yeah. So one thing that I would say, Daniel, is that the threshold to get the insanity defence is actually very high. So it's not just enough for the person that you're assessing to say that they were hearing voices or to act a little bit odd during their trial. The defence forensic psychiatrist has to prove on the balance of probabilities that, first of all, they had a disease of the mind, so they had a recognised psychiatric diagnosis. And again, that's not just assessing the patient in front of you, that's looking at all the medical notes, psychiatric notes, etc. That they had a defect of reason, so you've got to prove that they weren't able to have normal judgments. And either they didn't understand the nature and quality of the act, so they literally, in Andrea's case, literally didn't understand that she was drowning her children. Like, I don't know, she was hallucinating that they were vegetables that need to be washed, for example. Which is actually very rare. It's much more often the second limb, which is they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. So in Andrea Yates' case, because she felt compelled to do this in her mind to save her children, she thought what she didn't know what she was doing was wrong. So the threshold to tick all of those criteria is very high. So to put it into context, I probably am asked for a defence of not guilty of insanity by solicitors probably about 10 times a year, and I probably actually agree with it once or twice. So 80 to 90% of the time, I don't think cases meet that threshold. And it's really hard to fake because, as I just said, you're looking at all the medical evidence, and not just for the medical notes, also any kind of witness statements, CCTV. I mean, in Andrea Yates' case, there were no witnesses, but if they were, their description of how she would have acted would have been taken into account. Police interview transcripts, for example. Plus, I think their behaviour afterwards is a huge telltale sign. So I said this before, right? If somebody's done something like murder and retrospectively is trying to escape from it, then the chances are that their actions will be understandable, will be kind of sensible in that context. So they'll try and run away, they'll try and cover up what they did. Whereas someone like Andrea Yates immediately telephones the police and tells them what they did. That to me suggests that she didn't know what she was doing was wrong. Yeah.
It's
so
a bit odd.
Yeah, and to answer your other question, so if you get charged for something like murder and you don't get the insanity plea, then in the UK you face a life sentence. If you do get the insanity plea, then the judge only has 3 options. So in the court's eyes, the person who's committed the offence is not guilty. But that doesn't mean they're not dangerous, they don't need to be treated. And the 3 options are absolute discharge, supervision order, or a hospital order. So absolute discharge would be for a very low level kind of offence. So say somebody was psychotic and did some criminal damage, say smashed up a phone box, then the judge thinks that the case doesn't need to go any further. They would just drop the case. I would say that actually quite rarely happens, because if it's such a low level offence, they're probably not going to go through the trouble and the process of getting expert evidence. Then for a middle kind of tier severity of offence, you can have a supervision order. So that means you're not guilty, but you still need psychiatric treatment in the community. So you sign like almost a contract where you're followed up by a psychiatrist, have to take medication, have to take tests for illicit drugs, etc., etc. If you break that contract, then you can come back to trial.
And so presumably that'd be as an outpatient. So you're allowed home, you're back into the community, but you're under this sort of supervision. So you'd have to see somebody in frequency, medications, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So you serve. It's not a sentence, but you serve your order. It's a bit like a community order, I suppose, but you serve it under the care of a psychiatrist.
Is there a typical time frame for those orders?
Usually, it's kind of reviewed after about a year, and if the consultant psychiatrist says this person's completely stable, they don't need any more mental health treatment, and they're insightful, they're taking the medication, then the defence team can apply to have it rescinded.
That coincides with a couple of other things, actually. So a couple of tangents for law. If you have an unexplained fall and sort of passing out, and there's no other explanation, even if it's just a cold, some people do pass out from a cold. If there's no explanation at all, then you're not to drive for a year, if that's what the doctor thinks, if the doctor can't explain it. So 1 year seems to be about the assessment time frame for someone to say, well, there either is or isn't something wrong, or we've dealt with it. So that's a supervision order, which is interesting. So it's almost like the not guilty insanity verdict version of a community order, going into the community exactly as such, and then the final one is a hospital order, and that's the one that I definitely see most often in my work as an expert witness. So that's the court saying that this person's not guilty in the eyes of the law, but they definitely need hospitalisation. Usually it's for a serious offence, so usually it's in a secure unit. So somebody like Andrea Yates would be transferred to a psychiatric locked unit for offenders indefinitely. And you, to pick up on the wording there, which sort of tailed off the sentence, which I think a lot of people will miss out on, that word indefinitely is certainly one where, when we are learning law, and as I said to you before we recorded, most of us won't deal with these sort of cases unless, until you're a Queen's Counsel dealing with these sort of serious cases that come to these sort of verdicts. But indefinitely is certainly one that we sort of pick up during education and training and so on, because a custodial or a determinate sentence, as we call it, has a life, a fixed period, whether it's a year, a year in prison and then a year unlicensed, so a 2-year sentence or whatever it might be. Just as an aside, when someone is given a life sentence, and then people ask, well, why are they out in sort of 14 years if it's a life sentence? Well, the sentence lasts for your entire life. So when you leave prison, you are released on license. So you can be recalled to prison for virtually anything that you do wrong thereafter, because you're on license. The same goes if you if you're released early on good behaviour, or you serve half your sentence, and so on, you serve the remainder on licence, and that's the difference. And the key difference here, obviously, being with a hospital order, your words indefinitely. So a lot of people may not understand. Have you come across that people may attempt to run this defence, not understanding that third option, that if it's a successful defence, they might be indefinitely committed to a hospital, a secure hospital, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that in terms of how long the hospital order lasts for, so how long the hospital admission lasts for, that is completely at the whim of the forensic psychiatrist that's overseeing their care.
Yes.
I mean, if you were theoretically to say fake the defence and you get in, then it'd be relatively easy, I think, for you to be discharged, because one of the key factors is the patient being stable on the ward, not pushing boundaries, taking their medication, when they're eventually let out on leave, not going AWOL, not taking drugs on the wards. So, if you didn't have symptomatology of mental illness, it would be relatively simple to stay low risk or present yourself as low risk, so you could be discharged. But of course, actual psychiatric patients, there's a whole variety of their risk factors, and many of them, because of their symptoms, can't stick to those boundaries, or they are agitated, or they still hear voices and they get paranoid, get aggressive. So often the length of stay can be quite extrapolated. Yeah.
And just before we go back to the case study, to round that off with what happened with that, doubtless some viewers watching will be thinking that someone who has committed such a horrific crime must be guilty, must know that what they were doing was wrong. And as a consultant forensic psychiatrist, you know that the reasons that in law they may be found to be not guilty. How would you explain that to someone that takes those views, that would say to you, no, they must be guilty because they did this and they must know it was wrong?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I can understand how the layperson might think that anybody that's done something so horrific must know what they were doing. And maybe before I started my psychiatry training, I might have thought that myself. But
Indeed.
In my career, I've met some very, very unwell people, some floridly psychotic people who, are in complete perplexion, very, very confused. I've met men who are so paranoid that they barely leave their room in hospital for months, if not years. I've met people that have been absolutely tortured by voices. I've met people that have been so floridly manic that they, barely sleep. They're constantly agitated. They can barely form because they have such bad formal thought disorder. They're jumping in terms of their flight of ideas constantly. They can't sort of focus or hold down a conversation. I just want to make the point that the vast majority of people with psychiatric illnesses don't fit that profile, but the ones that I see that end up in these secure units are absolutely like that. So I guess my response would be, spend a week in a psychiatric unit and then tell me that everybody understands what they're doing, and I think that would change their minds. So as well as the case of Andrea Yates, I've assessed fairly similar cases actually. So one that jumps out to my mind, I think I've talked about her on your podcast before, but just very, very briefly, she was an 18-year-old girl who killed her 3-year-old nephew, and she genuinely believed that he had these demons inside of him, and so she suffocated him, believing that she was, saving his life by doing this. And she was just completely invested in that idea, and I believe that because I assessed her numerous times over many, many months, about 18 months afterwards, and she still held on to that belief every single day.
Interesting. And so just finally, before we round off the case study, what would you say to someone that might, let's say someone might question whether they've had thoughts, and they question themselves whether they have any sort of mental difficulty, as aside from just your average random thought versus something that would be something to worry about?
Yeah. Do you mean thoughts of hurting other people specifically, or
perhaps I wasn't thinking anything in particular, but perhaps some viewers watching may have some sort of thought that they might be worried about, and so at what point should they seek help, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah. I suppose that depends on their thoughts and the impulse that they have to carry it out, right? So if it's very dark thoughts, like thoughts of hurting themselves, thoughts of suicide, of hurting other people, then I would say the threshold to seek help would be very, very low. So first off, you want to see your GP, because that's the quickest way to be seen. If you're acutely worried about your own safety, then you might maybe have to take yourself to A&E, which is one of the quickest ways to see like an on-call psychiatrist. But I suppose there's a whole range, isn't there? There's people that can have quite dark thoughts regularly but don't have the impulse to act on them, and even though it's probably a bit distressing, that on balance they're actually probably quite safe. Whereas you get some people who are impulsive, for example, or who are naturally quite aggressive or antisocial, or people who might use a lot of drugs and alcohol, which will make them disinhibited. So those would all be risk factors, which means that they probably have a lower threshold for needing to seek support. Yeah,
it's an interesting distinction, because that impulse there is, I suppose we see it with everyday things. I mean, road rage, for an example, you'll see people getting very perhaps very angry at other people, but actually not do anything about it. Whereas someone will actually get out of the car and steam up to the car and try to start a fight or something. That sort of impulse, I think, is what you're talking about. Is the difference between someone being annoyed at somebody for something, but actually would never do anything about it.
It's fair to say that we all probably have murderous or at least semi-murderous thoughts towards like colleagues, ex-partners, noisy neighbours, road rage. So the thought itself is not the problem. It's as you say, it's the ability to control that impulse. That's the issue.
Indeed. So back to this this case study. So initially sentenced to life for murder, and then you said there was an appeal, and so the appeal was brought about by the defence. Yeah, it was.
So I have to say, sorry, there's one other bit that I forgot to mention about the original trial, which is that one of the reasons that Dr. Yates said that she couldn't have the insanity plea was because she heard the voice of Satan rather than the voice of God telling her what to do.
Right.
So he argued that if you're listening to Satan, then you know what you're doing is wrong. Okay. Whereas if you're listening to God, you don't, which to me makes absolutely no sense. You're saying that one person hearing voices gets sent to prison if they're hearing the voice of Satan, and given it's America, could have potentially got the death penalty.
Indeed.
And another person who has almost identical experiences but is hearing the voice of God gets to go to hospital. So it's completely illogical to me. But anyway, so as I said before, I was quite surprised that a lot of his very dodgy, I suppose is a nice way of putting it, evidence wasn't picked apart during cross-examination. I can only assume that the judge didn't have his thinking hat on that day. So initially they had that, and then there was a retrial, but it's quite a while later. So her original trial was 2002, the retrial was 2006, and then she eventually got the insanity plea and went to a psychiatric unit, which in my view is absolutely appropriate. I mean, nobody would argue that what she did was absolutely tragic and horrific, but as a psychiatrist, I feel that she needs treatment first and foremost if her actions were caused by mental illness rather than antisocial or hostility. But to end the story, she's actually in psychiatric unit to this day. I believe she has stepped down in levels of security because she's been relatively calm. But the interesting thing is, Daniel, is that she doesn't want to leave hospital. So every year she has a review where her and her solicitors and lawyers get the opportunity to argue a case for her to be discharged, and every year she turns it down.
Yeah. And so presumably she, do you think there's a degree of her accepting that she needs the treatment? Is that too far to say, perhaps?
It's hard for me to know for definite without speaking to her, but I imagine there's only a couple of logical scenarios. One would be that she's so unwell that she feels unsafe to leave. So she has gained some insight and she needs the treatment, as you say. I suppose another one would be that she doesn't have insight, doesn't believe she needs the treatment, but is still mentally unwell, like paranoid. So she would feel unsafe outside the confines of a hospital. I suppose another one could be that she just feels this horrific guilt for what she did and she doesn't want to continue a normal life. Like all three of those would be logical explanations to me.
And you think that's entirely possible for someone to feel that guilt, even though when they did it, they didn't believe it was wrong?
100%. So this 18-year-old schoolgirl I talked about before took about 18 months for us to medicate her psychotic delusions, and afterwards she eventually found like the reality of her actions seeped into her consciousness, and she had this horrific, dark depression, understandably, when she finally accepted what she did. So I've seen it firsthand.
Yes. Yeah. Fascinating. So there it is, a real case study, ladies and gentlemen. Very interesting and very unusual type of plea and type of result, and a few very fascinating thoughts there. Dr. Das has his own channel talking a lot more about a lot more cases like this. A Psych for Sore Minds, you've seen it on screen. It will be linked in the description below. Please do make sure you go and check that out. We want to grow Dr. Das's channel as much as possible, especially if you're interested in law and the overlap with psychology. I hope, Dr. Das, you'll be kind enough to join us back here again to talk about many more cases. Comments and thoughts in the box below, please. What other cases you'd like Dr. Das to talk about, and welcome him back here once more. Any closing thoughts before I let you go, Dr. Das?
Not really. I suppose my last thought about this case would be that I think that civilized society needs a framework to pick out the very small proportion, and I would stress it's a very small proportion of people like Andrea Yates who really are not in control of their actions. And many countries don't do that, or don't have the resources, the abilities, and people like that end up serving life sentences in prison where they just fester and become even more unwell. So I'm glad to be part of a system that helps those people. Indeed,
because it's clearly not helpful if someone is just in a prison which is not going to help them. It's not going to help them to recover. It's not going to help anyone else in the prison. It's not going to help anybody at all, is it? But if they're in somewhere that they can get treated for what's happened, and at least keep them and everyone else safe, if nothing else. But you obviously aim to improve matters. But absolutely, I can relate, being part of the legal system myself. So I do relate. So just one more reminder, do check out Dr. Das's channel, linked in the description below, and any other further thoughts and comments in the box below, please. And thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you.